The heart topic will be covered here in one video, although we may spend 2 lectures covering it in class. By the end of this video, you should be able to define heart, pulmonary and systemic circuits, atrium, ventricle, AV node, Purkinje fibers, SA node, EKG, systolic, and diastolic. Be able to differentiate the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Be able to draw the heart. It does not need to be accurate to every vein, but it should be at least a box with 4 chambers. Be able to diagram blood flow from one chamber of the heart to the next. Be able to compare pulmonary and systemic circuits and relate them to the heart chambers and, of course, to the lymphatic system, which we'll cover a little later. That's less important, but still part of this lecture. Draw an EKG, or an ECG as it's known, and define PQRST. List, define, and give causes of the various cardiovascular diseases. Shot to the heart, and you're to blame when you give love a bad name. You stab a vampire in its heart. We're going to the heart of our matter. Yes, the heart is in many different health problems, and cardiovascular disease are a major cause of death in America. Heart attacks, of course, are one of the most common, with over 250,000 deaths within a few hours of getting a heart attack per year. Congestive heart failure is a constant problem that can cause multiple other problems in the body. So by the end of this lecture, you should also be able to tell how we keep a healthy heart. It's the last slide. Here we see a heart, and if you've ever tried to eat one before, you know they're very tough. It's very dense muscular tissue. We also see some fat, which serves as cushioning for when the heart is beating, so that the heart, when it beats, does not compress the various veins and arteries that service the muscle tissue of the heart. So there's fat and blood vessels in the heart. We know that heart muscle is different than skeletal muscle because heart muscle has intercalated discs. And these discs between the muscle cells allow simultaneous contraction and the sharing of charge in any 2 cells that are adjacent and that will share these intercalated discs. The heart is surrounded by something called the pericardium. We'll get to back to that later. It's basically a thin sac in which there is fluid, in which there is a heart. And this allows the heart not to be rubbing up against other organs every time it beats. We will refer to something called the myocardium, which is a thick muscular layer of the heart. Remember, the heart is made of muscle. Let's look at the major parts of the heart and how blood flows through it. You may want to check in with someone who went to lecture because we are going to draw a kind of black box diagram of the heart and how the flow works in there in lecture. So there are atria and there are ventricles. You can see here that there are veins and arteries attending these. Veins are going to be going towards the heart. Arteries are going to be going away from the heart. So we see here labeled 1, both the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, and both of those empty into the right atrium. So the right atrium will collect blood from the body and from the head, and it will pump things into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will have a higher pressure and will pump things into the pulmonary arteries, both the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery, and these will go towards the lungs. Returning from the lungs are the right pulmonary vein and left pulmonary vein, and those veins will empty into the left atrium. Remember, veins are going towards the heart and they empty into atria. From the left atrium, blood will go into the left ventricle, and the left ventricle will pump blood into the aorta, and the aorta is a major artery that will then bring blood to other parts of the body. Only the 2 atria and the 2 ventricles are actually parts of the heart. All those associated veins and arteries are not counted as part of the heart. So you can see here how blood flows through the heart. Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. And to put this in a greater context, we can see both systemic and pulmonary circuits. You see deoxygenated blood entering the right atrium. Deoxygenated blood is being pumped by the right ventricle to the pulmonary circuit, which is the lungs. So those pulmonary arteries go away from the heart and into the lungs, and pulmonary veins come back from the lungs towards the heart, and they go into the left atrium. Here is oxygenated blood coming from veins of the pulmonary circuit going into the left atrium. It goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle, And that oxygenated blood is then pumped from the left ventricle out to the systemic circuit, which is the vessels for the parts of the body that are not lungs, specifically. Well, pretty much everything there. These are the different circuits of the body and puts the heart in a context showing why there is deoxygenated blood and why there is oxygenated blood. There are also vessels for the heart, and we are not going to cover them in this class in any depth beyond saying they exist. In future classes such as A&P, you will probably want to know these. The cardiac arteries provide blood to the muscly layer of the myocardium. So the myocardium, of course, has the muscles, and muscles need oxygen, and oxygen is provided by blood. Therefore, there is a blood supply to the heart. If there is a blockage here in the blood supply to the myocardium, then those muscles will not get oxygen. If they do not get oxygen, then the mitochondria in those cells will not be able to do oxidative phosphorylation, thus not enough ATP, and thus the muscle cells will not be able to function. Let's look at a heartbeat. So we're going to look at the heartbeat in three separate ways. First, we're going to look at how things pump. Then we're going to look at electrical conduction. Then we're going to look at the EKG, which is electrical conduction, but fancier. First off, we have atrial systole. Atrial systole is when both atria contract at the same time. The right atrium will pump blood into the right ventricle. The left atrium will pump blood into the left ventricle during atrial systole. Following that is ventricular systole. Both ventricles will contract, causing the AV valves to close and the semilunar valves to open. This brings blood from the ventricles out to the body. So blood will go into the pulmonary trunk, which will go to the pulmonary arteries, and will go to the aorta, which goes to the systemic circuit. After this, we have diastole, which is when the ventricles relax and begin to fill again with blood. This is the relaxation part, and as you may see, it's 0.4 seconds. Well, is that always true? Ask yourself, do all people at all times have the same pulse rate? If not, then you know that diastole can take a different amount of time. Also, I want you to think you hear that lub-dub of the heart. Well, what is that? Well, what that lub sound is when ventricular systole begins, the AV valves close. That's the first part of that sound. And then after ventricular systole happens, you're going to hear the dub sound as those semilunar valves close at the beginning of diastole. So that is why you hear the two sounds of the heart. Let's look at the electrical conduction of signals through the heart. There is a group of cells called the sinoatrial node that automatically depolarize themselves, which means they have an electrical charge across the cell membrane, and they will automatically, through several leaky channels, depolarize. When that happens, these muscle cells will contract. Remember, an electrical stimulus comes to a muscle cell, causing the muscle cell to contract. And when these cells contract, they will share the charge with all connected cells. And that means both atria will contract at the same time after the sinoatrial node depolarizes. This charge will move through the cells of the atria and will come to the atrioventricular node. This node causes a delay between the contraction of the atria and the contraction of the ventricles, because the atria and the ventricles are not connected to each other via intercalated discs, which means that they do not share a charge. That charge must go through the AV node and then down the Purkinje fibers to the base of the ventricle, and then will conduct from the ventricles from the bottom up, allowing blood to be pushed into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. This is how a charge moves through the heart to all four chambers. We can see this charge when we're looking at an EKG. Because it is a large charge, we can sense it from even the surface of the body. And we see here PQRST. All right, we're not going to go over this in too much depth. I just want you to notice that the P is the electrical activity of the atrial cells, and that's at the beginning of atrial systole. The QRS complex is the electrical activity of the AV node in the right atrium and conducting those impulses to the ventricles and causing the ventricles to contract. That's what the R right there is a ventricle contracting. And then as the ventricles relax, there is another bit of electrical activity. That's the T right there at the end. So that's a PQRST. The P to R interval is the time required for the impulse to travel from the SA node to the ventricles. If you see abnormal impulses, you'd see abnormal EKG results. And there's a whole slew of these that you will get to learn in another class if that's relevant to your job. What is definitely relevant to your job and to life in general is blood pressure. Now, you've seen that blood pressure, you have two numbers, and one is your systolic number, and that is when your ventricles are beating and pushing blood out of the ventricles into the systemic circuit. You can measure the level of pressure during systole. Diastole is when the ventricles are filling and your blood pressure goes momentarily down during diastole. It's moved along because the arteries actually will contract, and when these arteries are contracting, they'll continue to push blood forward. So the arteries expand during systole, absorbing some of that pressure, and then contract, pushing blood forward to the capillaries and keeping a constant blood flow in the capillaries, even if it is at a lower pressure. The lowest pressure is in the largest veins. Think the vena cava that's going to empty into the right atrium. We measure blood pressure with a sphygmomanometer, and that has this column of mercury, or is an electronic device that can measure pressure. And we see the cuff pressure here. We squeeze the blood, and what happens is there will be no movement of blood if we squeeze hard enough. When blood starts moving through, and we can first hear sounds with the stethoscope, then that is the systolic pressure, and that is your first number. When blood pressure when the sounds can no longer be heard because blood's constantly moving through, that's the diastolic pressure. So the difference between systole and diastole is basically measured here in the cuff and in the stethoscope that you're hearing it with. And someone asked me, what's the highest blood pressure ever recorded? And that was 370 over 350. Let's move on to some diseases and disorders of the heart. The first off, and most recent in the news, is pericarditis. This is an inflammation of the tissues surrounding the heart. The pericardium here is what's being inflamed. What's interesting is this can be a result of the COVID vaccine in 3 out of 100,000 children, making this a relatively minor kind of issue, which can be treated very easily by steroid application. What you may hear, however, is this inflammation causes deaths of thousands, or even I've seen it up to millions. It doesn't. This is a very easily treated inflammation that can be taken care of with pretty conventional medicines. It's not uncommon, though, and it's becoming more common, so something you should know. Angina pectoris, this is when you get those intermittent chest pains, which can be a precursor to a possible heart attack and would be definitely a moment to check yourself. Pain is actually felt in the skin because that visceral pain, viscera, meaning your insides, is co-associated with cutaneous, your skin, pain, and your body actually senses it in that area of the skin. This could also be a symptom of myocardial ischemia, also known as a heart attack, which kills about 250,000 people within a year, within 1 hour of symptoms. It leads to death of part of the heart tissue, and this is due to a lack of oxygen. The cells basically just die due to lack of oxygen. If the patient survives, the dead tissue is just walled off. The body does not have a way of restoring heart cells. The heart cells don't undergo mitosis, so there's no way to get new heart tissue naturally, and that can cause more problems later on, one of which would be congestive heart failure. This is when the heart is not functioning well and is not pumping blood sufficiently. If it's a weaker heart, or maybe a larger heart that has more muscle tissue and less pumping area. And this causes a backup of blood, which causes the accumulation of fluids in the lymphatic system. So we're not covering it in depth right now, but the lymphatic system brings fluids back because fluids can come out of the arteries and veins. They're supposed to. And here, there's too much fluid coming out, causing swelling in the ankles, excess fluid in the lungs, which causes coughing, and can cause swelling in the abdomen as well, which is colloquially known as dropsy, this edema in the abdomen. And there are about 400,000 cases per year. Two things that can easily get mixed up but are very different are atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis. So I want you to look at the word sclerosis. It means hardening. So arteriosclerosis is artery hardening. It's when the arteries become less flexible. And it happens with old age and, of course, with if you don't have enough antioxidants. Cholesterol buildup in the arteries is atherosclerosis. It's hardening of what's called an atheroma, which is this accumulation of fats in the arteries. So you have hardening of the arteries, arteriosclerosis. Hardening of the atheroma, atherosclerosis. And the atherosclerosis will cause reduced lumen volume, which means there's less space in an artery for fluid to flow through. And yes, this can cause a heart attack if it occurs in the vessels of the heart. Last up is hypertension. Hypertension is high blood pressure, which is always treated if your blood pressure is greater than 160/100. It's a long-term blood pressure can be a problem for strokes, heart failure, or kidney failure. So high blood pressure can be due to a large number of things, including stress and a high salt diet. And it can be cured by a large number of things like reducing stress, reducing salt in the diet, exercise, or there are pills, of course. So how do we keep a healthy heart? Well, not drinking and not smoking are going to help keep a healthy heart. Eating food, well, yes. What do I mean by that? I mean things that you recognize the ingredients of. Artificial cheese seasoning is not food. Don't eat it. It's not food. Cheetos, that's not real cheese. Maybe a little, but not all. Don't eat too much food. And mostly eat plants, which will give you a high dose of antioxidants, which is good for the blood vessels. Exercise regularly. Exercise is good for your heart. Muscle tissue also pumps blood. So low intensity muscle movement, like walking, is going to help your heart pump blood and is good for your heart. And of course, having good genetics helps, but I guess you probably can't really choose that. Anyway, that is the heart and how to keep it healthy.